world history. Secondly, the critical geopolitics criticize the myth of borders. Borders are very significant concepts of geopolitics. They distinguish not only states or political entities, but also they separate mentalities in a way. Therefore, borders are not only territory markers, they have been established in a way to create the perception of threat outside themselves by separating between the secure domestic and insecure international. So borders are very significant. They create dyadic perceptions, opposite perceptions. They create others, in a sense. Third, critical geopolitics argue that geopolitical knowledge itself is a discourse indeed. And this discourse is produced by three types of actors, being the statesman and bureaucracy. Tuateo and Dalby called this version of critical geopolitical discourse as practical geopolitics. There is the discourse, geopolitical discourse created by the strategic community and academy, which is called formal geopolitics. And there is the discourse created by popular culture, media, whatsoever, which is called popular geopolitics. So there is no discursive singularity in critical geopolitics. Rather, there is a discursive plurality. We have to be aware of that. Fourth, critical geopolitics criticizes the objectivity of geopolitical knowledge. For the critical geopoliticians, indeed, geopolitics can never be independent of value judgments, and it has always been used by political actors as a means to realize their own policies. So since discourses can rarely be objective, so is geopolitical discourse. And critical geopolitics finally argues that geopolitical knowledge is created within a temporal, spatial, and social context. And in order to understand geopolitical perceptions, one should deconstruct these contextual frameworks. So this is basically what critical geopolitics criticize against traditional geopolitics. There are very, very different variants of critical geopolitics, including radical geopolitics having a Marxist background, feminist geopolitics focusing on the distinction between the public and private spaces, masculinization of public and femininization of private spaces. There is post-colonial geopolitics dealing with colonial and post-colonial spaces and the hybrid spaces between them. There is green geopolitics, particularly studied by Dalby, which is focused on a new kind of security perception based on environmental threats. There is also postmodern geopolitics and anti-geopolitics or anti-politics. In other words, this discursive plurality is not only related with who produces the discourse, but also related with the themes, the spaces the critical geopoliticians try to uncover, in a sense. This is what I want to say for now, without bothering you too much. A very brief introduction of critical geopolitics and what it criticizes with regard to traditional geopolitics. Maybe Evren Hocam and Eylem Hocam will add something. Murat Hocam, Emre Hocam, please. Evren Hocam, we cannot hear you.
Oh, Thanks, Adrojan, and thanks for your introduction. By the way, to our old guests waiting, oh, Klaus joined us. I'm glad he's with us right now.
Oh, hello. Yes, sorry, I was a little quicker than I thought, so I'm very sorry for being 15 minutes late or so.
It's definitely absolutely fine. I was just going to use some filler words as a front band before you just join us. Well, I'm glad you made it. By the way, let me introduce you some of us here. Mustafa Serdar Palabıyık is an associate professor at Top University in Ankara. And Eylem Özkaya is an associate professor as well in Kırklareli University. Ece Yanardağ is one of our bursaries actually working with us on polar geopolitics and also on Indian Ocean. She's one of the new people on the block. Emre İşeri is also a professor working on energy geopolitics in İzmir Yaşar University. Also, there are others, numerous others, but Murat Yeşiltaş, I'm sure you heard his name. He's also a professor of security and working on security and geopolitics in Ankara Sosyal Bilimler, Social Sciences University. I'm sorry. Oh, by the way, Aslı with us as well. She's an associate professor at Ege University as well. So we're a thriving group. I mean, excited to listen to you, and I'm glad you joined us here. Lastly, I should say that Klaus was my supervisor. He was one of the people I really admired the most in the whole academic world. He and Pete Eddy supervised me during my frustrating years of doing PhD in London. But actually, my desire was to host him here physically in Turkey, but maybe next time after the pandemic sways, diminishes. Well, anyway, welcome, Klaus. Welcome to Turkey, and the floor is yours if you wish.
Yeah. Well, everyone, thank you very much, and can I just thank everybody, you know, just in terms of turning out, because I appreciate it's 2 hours ahead, I think, at least in Istanbul, and probably further, given the large size of Turkey. I'm sure you have at least 2 time zones. So whatever it is, I appreciate it. I know it's later for you than me. And secondly, I am sorry for being slightly late. I had a hospital appointment, and I was trying to race back as quickly as I could, and promptly also got very wet. We've had terrible weather here in London. So it was thunder and lightning. I got soaked. And anyway, so forgive me for being a little late, as I say. And so everyone said that, you know, the topic I could talk about, if you wish, is on kind of polar geopolitics, and say a few words about Arctic geopolitics. And I hope that sort of is of some interest. One thing I should say just before I hopefully share my screen and show you a few images and take you through a few things I'm interested in. I had the pleasure of being on, I think, an Istanbul-based TV show not so long ago. And the topic of conversation was Turkey's role in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And, you know, was Turkey an emerging polar power? So that was really interesting. And I had the pleasure of meeting a number of Turkish academics and people attached to the sort of Polar Research Center in Turkey concerned with such matters a couple of years ago, actually, when we still had face-to-face meetings and things were a lot simpler. And as everyone says, a lot more convivial. It's far nicer to be able to speak to you in person as opposed to via a screen. However, needs must. So let me, if I may, try and share my screen with you and offer a few thoughts in terms of what I wanted to try and, oops, where am I now? Try and say, share screen. Am I doing that? So let's see if this works. So, is that okay, everybody? Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, I've also got a cold, so forgive me also for sneezing and blowing my nose. So the title of the talk I was going to use this evening was Arctic Geopolitics, the melting, retreating and thawing of the frozen north. And in a way, I would like to offer you a sort of a meander through this particular topic, because actually for me, having worked on Arctic geopolitics on and off for 15 years, it's still an immensely confusing and difficult topic. And I often approach things in a rather meandering-like way. I'm not a very well-organized person, so I tend to have threads and that I try to pull together when I write books and the such like, but by and large, I tend to follow where my interests lie, and they're often quite nefarious and difficult to connect up. But I've deliberately used melting, retreating, and thawing, in part because I think it's almost impossible to speak of the Arctic nowadays without emphasizing the apparent physical disintegration of the Arctic. So not so long ago, we would have spoken fairly confidently, I think, about a frozen north. But that confidence in the elemental qualities of the Arctic appears to be shattering, if not shattered. The other reason I think I wanted to use those particular terms was because I've had the pleasure recently of working with a really very, very dear colleague called Sverker Solin, who's Professor of Environmental History at KTH University in Stockholm. And we've co-edited a collection of essays for Manchester University Press called Ice Humanities. And so one of the things that we've tried to do in the collection is to bring together a whole series of academics who are interested in ice, snow, permafrost, and anything else you can think of that has iciness, including, for example, glaciers. And part of that work is thinking about what's at stake when things melt, retreat, thaw. Some of that, of course, we can talk about in terms of, if you like, biogeographical, geochemical, but we can also talk about that, I think, in more societal and anthropological terms. And certainly, and you'd expect me to say this as a geographer, there's always geographical qualities to melting, retreating, and thawing. In other words, things don't happen in a spatially uniform way, and they certainly don't happen in a chronologically consistent way either. Let me just see if I can go to the next slide. Oh, there we are. So let me just pick up on this point I've just made right at the start, which is about this idea of the frozen north. So one of the things you can do in terms of tracking and tracing the Arctic is to look at what is produced every year, and has been, I think, for the last 15 odd years, by the US agency NOAA, in terms of what they call their Arctic report card. And it provides a very neat little summary in terms of where we are with various parts of the Arctic as a volume. So there's a huge amount of interest every year in measuring things, quantifying things, assessing things, and sea ice is certainly one of the key elements that certainly receives quite a considerable degree of scrutiny. And in 2017, and this is why I've highlighted it here on the slide, there was this quite arresting comment actually about the Arctic shows no signs of returning, to reliably frozen region of recent past decades. And the thing that caught my eye straight away was the idea of being a reliably frozen region. What did that actually mean? And why was that significant? And in 2019, for the first time, the Arctic Report Card actively solicited the views and perspectives and knowledges of the Bering Sea Elders Group, which is based in Alaska. And so for the first time, there was a kind of Indigenous scientific dialogue as part of this report card. And one of the things, of course, that this allowed, I think, probably for the first time, was to think about the very real human consequences of melting, thawing, and retreating. And I think what that also enabled to do, it acted as a sort of corrective to a certain kind of Arctic geopolitics, which has perhaps been overly dominated by, certainly for those of you who are IR scholars, you would probably recognize as realist scholarship, or scholarship that places a great deal of focus and emphasis on what states are doing, or even what great powers are doing, as opposed to what communities or small groups are coping with. And hence the reason why we often make distinctions, say, between human security and, say, the kind of work that might go under the banner of great power security or great power geopolitics. So I think this question of a new Arctic was really interesting to me, because as a geographer, one of my sort of primary preoccupations is how places and regions get framed, get represented, and then get put in, how do those representations or framings get then put into practice? It might be policy, it might be certain activities or practices. Oops, let's see if I can move this. So in order to sort of, in a sense, set the context a little more for what's to follow, I just want to make a couple of more general observations about why does the Arctic matter. So if, for example, we accept just for a minute, there is a new Arctic emerging, which is a great deal more fractured and less stable than perhaps it once was. Why does all this matter? Why does it, for example, have something to tell us that goes beyond the Arctic itself? Well, a number of things, I think. Number one, I think there's been a great deal of interest in both IR, geopolitics, security studies, and a range of disciplines across the arts and humanities and social sciences, trying to think about the challenges, the conceptual, the empirical, the policy-related challenges that both climate change and our so-called anthropogenic era pose us. And to put it straightforwardly, I think a number of scholars, and IR in particular, have spoken about this sort of transition from a sort of Holocene sense of the Earth, relatively stable, where, for example, one could parcel up various elements and territories and distinguish between an interstate system, and where one could simply talk about managing transboundary movements and flows, to something more a kind of anthropogenic IR, which is a great deal less stable, a great deal more dynamic, and where actually there is much more at stake than simply managing transboundary movements and flows. If anything, some of the fundamental elemental distinctions between land, sea, and ice are clearly up for grabs. Secondly, governance challenges. So you and I all know there's vast literature on governance and transnational challenges. And the Arctic, I think, presents a fascinating and challenging case study of how difficult it is to reconcile, as I put here, complex interests and wishes, when actually in so much of the Arctic, we're seeing more and more evidence of a growing array of stakeholders. And perhaps that's one of the newer elements to the Arctic. It is becoming institutionally thicker in terms of governance, and the array of actors and stakeholders has grown markedly, I think, in the last couple of decades. Thirdly, we are also seeing in the Arctic, as we're seeing, for example, in the global commons, such as the oceans, really at times quite stark divisions and distinctions between what I put here simply resource extraction versus conservation management. The two, of course, are not necessarily dichotomous. Conservation management can work with, against, and simply rub up along with resource extraction. And some of this, of course, is brought into stark relief when we think about, for example, indigenous communities who often have quite complicated and diverse views about resource extraction. So, for example, one of the things I think would be utterly wrong to say is that Indigenous communities are anti-mining. And you sometimes get these really very stark statements being made about Indigenous and Northern communities. And I think that just simply doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And that's probably true, by the way, almost certainly true of any other Indigenous community, non-settler community that you care to study around the world. And then fourthly, which I think is really quite interesting and challenging, is the Arctic becoming less exceptional? One of the things about the polar regions, it often attracts strong exceptionalism, that the Arctic and Antarctic are special places, unusual places, because they're remote, because they're characterized by large amounts of ice or snow, because populations are thin. And I don't think that exceptionalist bent to a great deal of scholarship really holds terribly well anymore, if it ever did. And actually, where I think one of the challenges, and it's quite exciting actually, is to see this emergence, I think, in terms of academic scholarship between what I think of as sort of Arctic specialists, often grounded in disciplines such as anthropology, and I think a different kind of scholarship, which is coming through geopolitics, IR, which is perhaps less inclined to think of the Arctic as a sort of detailed case study, and to think about how actually the Arctic might even inform conceptual and theoretical work in disciplines such as IR and geopolitics, particularly around this, perhaps this anthropogenic turn. Okay, so if that's the sort of general overview of some of the things I think punctuate this, the interest in Arctic geopolitics, let me just say very quickly what is Arctic geopolitics, and just perhaps some of my sort of underlying approaches to the topic that kind of interest me, at least anyway. So Arctic geopolitics I do think of as both a textual and a visual set of practices. I could probably pluralize practice. I think of it as distinct to the geopolitics of Arctic, which I think is a different kind of a strand of literatures. And secondly, when I think of spatial practices in particular, I tend to become myself most interested in the things that I've noted here. So relationality, how does the Arctic work alongside other key scalar terms, such as the global? I'm always interested in borders and bordering, and what's at stake, given that we're dealing with often many messy overlapping borders. The way in which space is inscribed or inscripted, and it also may be rarefied as in terms of as seen as part of integral to a nation's territory or sense of history and geography. And as a geographer, of course, this can be made manifest in lots of different ways, such as maps, displays of power, interterritorial relationships, and some of which I'm going to show you in a second through a few images to bring that point further, I hope, to bear. And I think, by the way, that is different, I hope by the end of all of this, to what I think of the geopolitics of the Arctic, which often takes for granted both geopolitics and the Arctic, and in particular thinks of the Arctic as a kind of spatial container where geopolitics simply unfolds. Whereas I think the Arctic I try to work with is often multiple, overlapping, confusing, and at times contradictory. So I don't assume there is one Arctic. I don't think that's helpful. Okay, so to make perhaps the point, what's at stake here? One is, if I think of the Arctic, I tend not to start off thinking it's easily definable by a two-dimensional map or a line like the Arctic Circle. And the Arctic Circle runs just above Iceland, as you probably know, and goes all the way around, hence the dotted line. And that's often privileged by many maps and even Arctic scholars as the kind of one way in which you might define the Arctic. Another, of course, is to take a completely different approach, which is to think of the Arctic as more nebulous, as a kind of frozen north. And this is one which has a very particular Western, often imperial, colonial set of traditions associated with it. Some of it will be visual, some of it will be textual, but this is a place often, as many scholars have noted, where it's highly romanticized and fantasized as a place often for white Western adventure, mainly men. But note, please, these kind of, if you like, these conceptions of what is the Arctic, where is the Arctic, I think still play out very much today in terms of these often quite, if you like, overlapping and quite contradictory views of the Arctic. So, I can tell you, for example, NOAA, for example, is warning there's a new Arctic in the making. It's no longer reliably frozen. An Arctic is disintegrating. But at the same time, I'm sure, there are plenty of examples of the Arctic still being portrayed as a kind of polar wasteland or as a kind of untouched wilderness, which I don't think really holds up to scrutiny. And of course, the other thing, which is really desperately important to be very clear on, is that the Arctic is an inhabited space. So wherever that line, or where the Arctic begins or ends, all of the key Arctic states have a keen sense of where the Arctic, or perhaps wider north, begins or ends. And all of them would be keen to stress, as of course would indigenous communities, northern communities, that the Arctic has been inhabited for millennia. So some of the maps here I just show you to illustrate some of the major settlements, but also the proportionality, broadly speaking, of indigenous and non-indigenous. And each and every Arctic state has its own complicated relationship with indigenous communities, and each and every Arctic state has, if you like, varying numbers at play. And one of the things we should say straight away about demographics and data is that it is yet again another complicated story about how we find data for population numbers. It's not straightforward, and much of it is caught up with settler colonialism. And there's often still a great deal of suspicion and mistrust amongst communities about number counting and classifying. So, there's a kind of, if you will, a sort of biopolitics here that goes hand in hand with the geopolitics in terms of the control and regulation of indigenous bodies. And some of that is through statistics, as others have noted before me. And then the other thing I just want to very quickly say also about the Arctic is, for all the focus on the Arctic states and the indigenous peoples, it's also just worth mentioning as well that there are a sort of parts of the Arctic, particularly around the Central Arctic Ocean, North Pole, that have also been framed and reframed as international spaces, or even as a global commons. And one of the things the European Parliament did in 2008, which made the institution very unpopular with Arctic states, was to suggest, for example, that much of the Arctic was akin to the Antarctic, and therefore why couldn't there be an Arctic treaty to coincide with an Antarctic treaty? So I think it's incredibly important to recognize that the ways in which the Arctic is framed and represented and made sense of carries with it very real consequences in terms of practices and interventions. And I think after much protest from Arctic states, that proposal was rapidly dropped. Okay, so I've got a lot of slides here, so I won't dwell on these things too many, but simply to make the point as well that we're dealing also here with many, many different kinds of spaces and places. This is as I say, this is an overlapping, complex set of environments and locales that we're dealing with. And if nothing else, just to make the simple point, there are 3 North Poles, not 1, and this is the one that often attracts the most interest, but it is not the only one. So this idea of the frozen north, I think, has been particularly alluring over the centuries, but particularly the last 150 years. The idea that, for example, if only we could reach the North Pole, there might be all kinds of exciting possibilities. And one of the most compelling was the idea that there would be an open polar sea, free of ice, and potentially a resource wonderland, if only it could be found. Those who did reach the North Pole in 1909, the Perry expedition with people like Matthew Hansen, the first African American to get to North Pole, discovered that it was largely a frozen ocean. Unthinkably, of course, 100 years later, that frozen ocean is increasingly being spoken about as a partially frozen ocean. So much has changed. But what has also changed is even the magnetic North Pole has also been on the move, and increasingly so. So again, it's just, I think there is this sort of odd juxtaposition between ways in which we can chart the highly dynamic, unstable Arctic, and yet there's also something far more enduring about the Arctic, which is being framed repeatedly as frozen north, as polar wasteland, as untouched wilderness. And this is a very awkward juxtaposition, I think, which carries with it consequences for Arctic geopolitics. And just to make the case, there is also another pole, to remind you, of relative inaccessibility, which has also had a series of competing representations and framings over the years. But again, note, often attracting European and American explorers and speculators and chancers seeking fame and fortune. But I talked about rarefication. I think it's also important to say that the Arctic, the far north, has also been absolutely integral to national geopolitical framings and investments. And probably one of the most striking has been the Soviet Union from the 1930s onwards, thinking of the Arctic as nature that had to be tamed by the Soviet state. And through, for example, all kinds of extraordinary exploits, such as landing planes in the North Pole, to rapid expansion and deliberate population of the Soviet far north, the Soviet Union quickly established itself as the leading Arctic power. And much of that remains intact to this day, whether it's through icebreakers, whether it's through infrastructure, whether it's through ambitious resource development. This has been a huge, huge investment by the country, and largely continued, and indeed intensified under the current leadership. So, for example, the 150th anniversary, there was a particular, quite impressive actually, display organized around the North Pole, where a commemoration was held, sort of celebrating Soviet achievement. And that's really what I meant about the sort of the displays of power. This has become hugely important, I think, in the contemporary Arctic, who can project in not only infrastructure and reach, but also the kind of visual cultures that I think also underpin expressions of Arctic geopolitics. And this is not unique, by the way, to the Soviet Union. This was also true of the United States during the Cold War, and iconic moments such as submarines puncturing through Arctic sea ice clearly were one feature of this quote unquote Cold War. It also sometimes made itself manifest in civilian stakeholders as well, who were sort of keen to project this capacity to work through the Arctic and to show that it was a space, a bridge, if you will, and not just simply a container. It was something one could pass through, pass over, go up and above. So I think it's very much a kind of porous volume as opposed to a sort of inscribed region. And I think what's changed, of course, in part of the intervening period in the post-Cold War era, is that at one stage, for example, if there was huge monitoring under the ice, what has changed is that much of that monitoring interest is now above the ice as much as under the ice. And the Arctic has become a data point, not only for the military, but also increasingly a global scientific community. And so the Arctic as a place of interterritorial relationships, I think is incredibly important. You know, first it was the ice core from Greenland. Now, for example, it's increasingly sea ice research that has really sort of opened up the Arctic as a kind of a global space for knowledge generation and transmission. And I think that's had implications for both the geopolitics of the Arctic, but also Arctic geopolitics. So in essence, I think what I've been really interested over the last 15 years, both as an academic observer, but also somebody who's worked, for example, in the UK Parliament and other organizations such as NATO on Arctic futures, is these different kinds of spaces. And the thinking of the Arctic as a complex volume where things cut across, cut through, where height and depth make a difference, and where our two-dimensional maps do a really poor job, I think, in helping us to understand what's at stake. So these kind of themes for me are recurring ones in terms of how space gets made and remade in particular ways. It might be, for example, territorial zones. It might be, as is often the North Pole, a kind of space for internationalism and relations between and beyond the Arctic. Or it might be where, for example, the state is very eager to impose its borders and to say, this is our Arctic, as opposed to their Arctic. And all of that, I think, stands in quite sharp contrast and often painful tension between what I put here at the bottom, kind of indigenous knowledges and experiences, and a kind of, both bounded and also relational space-making practices. So let me just give you a couple of examples of this, all these different kinds of things at play. So, for example, the North Pole has long, I think, entertained the idea that this is a sort of a performative space, if you like, for its expressions of internationalism. This is the Swedish icebreaker Odin, and a party, many parties in the past and present have travelled to the North Pole and taken these kind of photographs to showcase the internationalism of science in the Arctic, and you can see all the respective flags there. It's also interesting, quite an important little project here for the Swedish government, which is an Arctic state, but not an Arctic Ocean coastal state. So it's a way of using the icebreaker to emphasize Sweden's broader reach into the Arctic region. Finland does exactly the same. So the two main non-Arctic Ocean coastal states put their icebreakers to work to enable this kind of relational internationalist Arctic. And of course, breaking through the ice still appeals to both Arctic and non-Arctic states alike. So the Arctic has also functioned as a way of showcasing the UK-US special military relationship. And these kinds of images deliberately, I think, hark back to and are nostalgic for some of those Cold War iconography of the nuclear-powered submarine still being able to project its power all over the Arctic Ocean. And I think all of that, of course, sits with the last 30 years of Arctic cooperation and I think redefinition of the region as a far more complex human and physical space. And although I'm showing you yet another two-dimensional map, the lines themselves, I think, also multiple lines, also give some clues, I think, to the ways in which two different visions of Arctic borders, I think, have emerged in this period. One has been absolutely a hardening of national borders, the idea that there are these distinct Arctic states who have sovereignty over land, sea, and ice. And another, which is actually working hard to project a circumpolar vision of the Arctic, where there might be multiple lines and boundaries depending on what you care to focus on. So not just the Arctic Circle, but increasingly all kinds of other markers, much of which, of course, is being implicitly, I think, undermined by climate change. So for example, in the past, people would have pointed to things like the tree line or the continuous permafrost and said, this is where the Arctic begins or ends. Much of that is now being scrambled by the warming Arctic, where, for example, we find trees in places we didn't once find, or, for example, we find permafrost is far less continuous than it once was. So it's interesting, actually, how these understandings of the Arctic are becoming increasingly fluid, and that carries with it consequences, I think. Okay, so just a couple more things, because everyone, I didn't want to speak too long, because I think you said it was really conversation and discussion, so I don't want to overdo it.
Absolutely fine. Yeah. We're very thrilled to be able to listen to you, especially for me. It's a pleasure after long years. So please go ahead.
Yeah. So, well, let me not take up too much time, because I obviously enjoy the conversation and comments and questions and thoughts and all the rest of it. So let me just say a couple more things about what's going on at the moment, and I think where we might want to keep our eyes open. So number one, I think there is a growing interest in the state and the permanence of, I think, Arctic borders, and actually what's at stake here. So one of the things that's been quite interesting to watch in my own work, working for various agencies, has been this concern about whether climate change is culpable for making Arctic borders unsettled, or exposing the fact that some Arctic borders are not as settled as some parties might wish for. And a sort of a cautionary note here, because I think some of the concerns about Arctic borders often actually really act as proxies for broader anxieties about the geopolitical implications of rapid change. And nowhere is that, I think, more keenly felt than in Canada, where thawing, melting, and retreating have often, I think, been accompanied by anxieties about the unrestricted mobility of others, and a sort of a sense in which ice performed a kind of elemental security purpose in terms of making it difficult for others to work their way in and through the Arctic. Whereas, for example, excuse me, international legal regimes, which are, as I think many people understand well, very good at making new geographies, have also played a hugely important part in actually unsettling borders. So, for example, in the past, it would have been unthinkable that borders along the bottom of the Arctic Ocean would extend all the way across the Arctic Ocean from the North Pole and beyond, because nobody really thought about using international legal mechanisms to do so. The Russians were the first in 2001, and since then, there's been a huge amount of interest in trying to extend so-called sovereign rights over the Arctic seabed. And this has kind of generated, I think, quite an interesting tension between a sort of a seabed Arctic Ocean and the Arctic Ocean as water. And so these elemental distinctions between rock and water and ice, I think, have been hugely important in shaping various iterations of Arctic geopolitics. And that most famously expressed itself through this particular image, which you may well recall, from 2007, when a Russian flag was planted at the bottom of the Central Arctic Ocean. And really what that led to was a sort of flourishing of a new iteration of Arctic geopolitics, much of which revolved around the idea that there was now a new scramble for territory and resources, and an absolute frenzy of map making was unleashed in 2007 onwards, which really hasn't stopped, trying to show where all these parties are trying to project their power and influence through legal mechanisms. And none of this will come as a great surprise, because, of course, I don't have to rehearse all the intrigue surrounding the Eastern Mediterranean when it comes to maritime borders and interests in seabed. Well, this is also taking place in the Arctic with huge gusto, with all the three main parties, Canada, Denmark, Greenland, and Russia, all trying to project their sort of sovereign rights ever further, ever closer to one another's exclusive economic zone. So maps, oceanographic data, flags, ships have been caught up in this sort of medley of actors and activities and practices, trying to remake Arctic geopolitics. And there's a great deal, I think, here at stake. And some of it, I think, comes back to what I talked earlier about the rarefication of national territory. So this was a very common map, and you still see it occasionally in Canadian governmental discourse and practice, which is the idea that the Canadian state went all the way to the North Pole under the so-called sector theory from the 1920s. Now, it has absolutely no legal foundation, but you can still find maps like this circulating around federal government websites and documents. And there remains to this day something very, very alluring for many of these states, that they do indeed begin and end at the North Pole. So Stephen Harper, the former Canadian Prime Minister, was quite a keen advocate of this idea that Canada was growing, extending northwards and growing in area, including, of course, the Arctic Ocean seabed. Russia, of course, was equally taken with the idea. This is Arthur Chilingarov, the distinguished oceanographer, who placed the Russian flag at the bottom of the Central Arctic Ocean in his flat with an appropriately large map of the Arctic Ocean, who said, you know, the Arctic is ours, whilst holding a flag and a polar bear, a stuffed polar bear, sorry, a toy polar bear, to be clear, because that would have been quite impressive. So I think what we're seeing is maps continue to play a hugely important part in Arctic geopolitics, and they're being drawn and redrawn as this activity unfolds. And this has become at least one way of thinking about how the Arctic gets repositioned and reallocated in all kinds of ways, some of which, as I say, being aided and abetted by international legal regimes and measures. And all of this, of course, creates its own set of tensions, because one of the jobs that the Arctic community, particularly through the Arctic Council, which created in 1906, is trying to do, is to hold together this sort of coherent sense of the Arctic as a circumpolar and shared region between those 8 states and their indigenous peoples. And that's proving, I think, harder and harder, partly because there are disputes over Arctic territories and spaces, as I've already alluded to, but also partly because the Arctic is becoming increasingly a complicated, interterritorial, interregional space as well. So, for example, right up here in the Central Arctic Ocean, there will also still be pockets of seabed that are called the area, and there will inevitably be international waters. That means that there will be a wider global interest in how this particular semi-enclosed ocean is managed. And one of the keenest exponents of that global Arctic is not the Arctic states, but is actually those just outside the region, the near Arctic states, as China would have it, pushing and prodding to ensure that the Arctic has this sort of global dialogue and engagement. It's not just something for the Arctic states to govern and resolve. So anybody who attends the Arctic Circle meetings before COVID in Iceland every October would not have failed to come away with a very, very keen sense that Asian states in particular, Japan, China, Singapore, Korea, were very, very vocal advocates that this was not just a sharply defined regional space that was just dominated by the interests of the Arctic states themselves. And then finally, just to end, because I promised I wouldn't go on too long, one of the things that I think has just been a consistent undercurrent of Arctic geopolitics has been a kind of indigenous geopolitics, a kind of geopolitics that is deliberately pushing back against both the historic experiences of settler colonialism and state building, but also, I think, pushing back against nation states, the Arctic states in particular, for using international legal regimes to further foreground state power, state practices, such as, for example, exclusive economic zones, extended continental shelves, but also to try and securitize energy projects, resource development initiatives in ways that often end up marginalizing indigenous peoples and their interests and wishes, some of which, of course, might align with state priorities, but some of which may certainly not. And for me, of all the documents, the many, many documents I've read over the years relating to the Arctic, this is probably still my favorite and probably one of the most elegantly written and powerful documents, which makes the case not only that the Arctic is an inhabited space and has been for millennia and was inhabited way before any nation state was created, but also makes, I think, the compelling case for thinking of the Arctic not only in elemental terms, in terms of land, sea, ice, weather, and so on and so forth, but also I think in really quite subtle, complex human and elemental terms as well as the more than human, thinking that actually this space is not easily reducible to a map with lines on it, and that this space is also caught up with a whole series of knowledges and practices that can't necessarily be captured by simply those that both nation states and international organizations determine and dominate. So that's just, it's a little meander through some of the kind of interests in Arctic geopolitics I have. I did have more slides for you, but I'll stop at that point because hopefully that just gives a little bit of a flavor of some of the things I've been thinking about and working on, for the last, as I say, 15 odd years on and off. So thank you.
Klaus, it was such a pleasure to listen to you. Actually, although I was your student for 5 years, I guess, this is for the first time, I guess, I listened to your presentation about polar geopolitics. Normally, most of your research for the scientific community, although you're very well known about your research on polar geopolitics, you're mostly well known for popular geopolitics. So it was such an illuminating moment for me as well. And now we're gaining traction as Turkish scholars as well about our interests towards Arctic and Antarctic. And thanks for also joining us and making this beautiful presentation. So I can take the floor with my first questions, but before that, is there anyone who wants to have any questions?
Can I also just interject as well? I really do want to, I'd love to hear your views about Turkey's relationship to the polar regions. That really does interest me as well. So
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
So thanks.
Anyone wants to kick off? Okay, I'll kick off first then. As you put it, Arctic looks like a very remote region, both Arctic and Antarctic. But in terms of its effects and political effects and physical effects, they're not that remote anymore. They are really making their effects felt across the globe, both politically and physically, due to climate change. And as you know, as you just questioned, yes, Turkey recently, in the last 5 years, and especially in the last 3 years, increase its political presence, tried to increase its political presence in the region, especially through scientific endeavors, right? And this is not about, seemingly, this is not about geopolitics, but mostly about having a say in the usage of global commons. However, Arctic region to me seems like a 0 point for us to start our dissection about the construction of geopolitics. Because to me, geopolitics is a kind of, thanks to the critical geopolitics, we started to think about geopolitics as a kind of political engineering process. But to me, critical geopolitics is trying to do it from the opposite direction and making it, a kind of reverse engineering. A kind of reverse engineering of geopolitics. So the presence, the new presences especially in the region, and as you put it, the changing fluid dimensions, new relationalities used to new map makings of the region allow us to reconsider how geopolitics really is made. It's a grand moment for us to dissect, the anatomy of geopolitics, because you said new spatial dynamics are being used, new visual performances are on practice. Inuits and native people, their presence, their histories, their paths, their discourses are being used to legitimize the presence, the geopolitical presence in the region. And I recently read the document from, I think, Australian strategic paper about the, not the Arctic, but on Antarctic. They say that Australia and other Western powers in the region should hold the objectivity of science to deter the presence of Chinese and Russian and other new powers, non-Western powers, scientific endeavors in these regions. Because they know that they're trying to use scientific power there as a geopolitical intervention vehicle. So this is really interesting for me. That's why critical geopolitics is really important in this respect for the region, for allowing us to see how geopolitics is really constructed. Secondly, one of the interesting things is polar regions are global commons, right? But in terms of international legal procedures and governance of these regions, who are these global commons? Seems like they're mostly Western powers. The inconspicuous absence of non-Western scientific endeavors and geopolitical presence there about the usage of global commons seems like, yeah, inconspicuously absent. So what do you think also about the presence of Turkey and other kind of powers, their scientific endeavors in these regions? Of course, there are lots of stuff there up for grabs, but what science do? What does scientific endeavor do there in terms of these kind of issues?
Yeah.
Lastly, sorry for bugging you with lots of questions. Emre just raised his hand, sorry. In your presentation in TRT, I guess. By the way, can you hear me? Oops. My internet might just Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think your
Cool.
your image is frozen just for a second, that's all.
Oh, yeah, okay. By the way, I didn't tell you, during my PhD, I had lots of travails, interesting stuff happened in my life. And recently, 3 months ago, my parents' house just burned down, almost to the ground, half of the house. So I'm actually in another place during these restoration processes, and I'm just using my cellular phone as a hotspot. So if my internet connection just goes off, I'm sorry about that. But that's my newest travail. Well, anyway, so my third question is, in your TRT World presentation, your last point was on how Turkey is using labor power in the Arctic region. That was very interesting. Because, yes, quantity-wise, population use is a kind of policy of Turkish geopolitics. And it's not a novel issue in terms of, when you think about the past, the history of the Eurasian geopolitics from the 1500s, from the 5th century as well. So quantity is important. We see a kind of quantitative power coming from population. And it's also up for grabs. And Turkey has a very important edge on that, especially in terms of Eurasia. And you just said that Turkey is trying to use that, devise that quantitative power. What do you mean by that? And what's Turkey and such new regional powers in the region can do? I'm sorry, I talked a lot. So would you like to start from these questions, or we can have another question? I talked too much, maybe you should start with these ones.
Yeah, I mean, no, thanks, Evren. I'm really sorry to hear about your parents' house. I mean, that's really very distressing.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're able to join us. So, needless to say, so I think there's a lot there, and I'd be the first to admit, I just offered a whistle-stop tour, and there are lots of things I didn't talk about because this is like any topic. You could talk for hours easily. Yeah. Let me just say a couple of things. Number one, sorry, excuse me. The Euro-Western encounter with the Arctic, broadly speaking, the last 500 or 600 years, has been profoundly extractive. It has not just been about settler colonialism. It has also been about extracting things, and some of those things include imagery, some of those things include knowledge, and some of those things include resources. And that continues to this day. And the Arctic has also proven a very fertile ground for not only a whole series of textual and visual cultures and interventions, but it also has enabled different kinds of outsiders, if I can put it in those terms, to use the Arctic to literally ground their geopolitics, their political intervention. So, for example, in the 1970s, environmental groups took to the sea ice to protest against indigenous and commercial sealing. And so we had the spectre of, for example, the French actress Brigitte Bardot finding herself on the Canadian ice, highlighting what she just thought of as simply a barbaric practice. So whether it's been seals, whales, oil, gas, you name it, there has also been a kind of environmental geopolitics that I could have easily talked about as well, that has played its part in making and remaking the Arctic. I think the other thing that does speak to a lot of classical geopolitics is that the polar regions also, I think, have often acted as the kind of perfect geopolitical fantasy space. This is where the distinctions between land, sea, ice appear to be fairly stark, where, for example, the Arctic and the Antarctic because of its comparatively fixed geographies, as we might have thought in the past, also became these sort of laboratory spaces to think about how states behave in thinly populated, remote spaces that were nonetheless accorded great strategic and resource significance. Science, I think, has often been deeply embedded in geopolitics and vice versa. So there is, in essence, it's almost impossible to think of science without thinking about geopolitics and also biopolitics. So if one thinks about, for example, what happened to many, many indigenous peoples in the Arctic, much of that revolves around experimentation on the one hand, some of it quite simply quite ghastly. But on the other hand, it also has been about population control. And that's not just counting, that as you know, people who will know this well, moving communities from one place to another as part of a very, very deliberate set of controlling mechanisms and spatial strategies. Some of it involving, for example, you may have seen it recently, residential schools that have yet more scandals emerging in Canada, but this was also true in Denmark, Greenland, and other Arctic spaces. I think your point about governance is an extremely interesting one, because I worry a little bit in the rush to embrace anthropogenic IR and geopolitics. What we end up doing is rarefying Euro-Western interests. You know, so suddenly it's kind of everything is about the Anthropocene, and one can somehow assume that everything else, including settler colonialism, is in the past. I don't think it's ever going to be as neat and tidy as that. And of course, one of the impulses, I think, behind decolonizing IR, decolonizing governments, has exactly been to think far more explicitly about those sort of power knowledge relationships that underpin governance and the will often to dominate. And so the way I read interventions, both by, for example, indigenous peoples, is simply a continuation of a struggle that has been going on for at least 500 years. But I think also newer actors in the polar regions, including Turkey, I think, pushing back against certain kinds of norms, rules, expectations about who should be part of the Arctic and who shouldn't. And part of that, I think, has brought into sharp relief the Arctic Council itself, which when it was created, declared, self-declared, that there were 8 Arctic states, and by definition, everybody else was a non-Arctic state. And that also, I think, partially explains the hostility to China, for example, describing itself as a near-Arctic state in 2018. So when I made my comment about, I think, Turkey and Labour power in that short interview with TNT, I think I was trying to think, and of course you don't get the time and space on television to do so. Yeah. I was trying to think about, you know, if you were to juxtapose that, say, with the importance of Turkish Labour going to countries like Germany during the sort of Cold War era, what might the role of labour flows, for example, do to further complicating this distinction between Arctic and non-Arctic in ways that I think, you know, we've seen elsewhere in the world, where suddenly actually these relationalities become incredibly important, I think, in complicating sharp distinctions, which some countries might be desperately invested in making between where, in this case, where the Arctic begins and ends. And the reason I made that comment about Turkish laborers being the Russian North was because I don't think it had been given much attention, but actually suddenly it became brought out almost by accident because of the pandemic. And then actually precisely because people were held in place and borders were shut down, it also began to reveal these kind of relational geographies. And that would include also the Russian-Chinese relationship as well, being fascinating, where, you know, there are all kinds of very interesting codependencies, much of it in everyday life, kind of people on people codependency, not just big Russian energy extraction projects, Chinese financing. You know, I think as critical geopolitics and lots of strands of IR scholarship has also tried to work through, is, you know, there are these kind of everyday geopolitics, everyday IRs, and there's also these other kinds of IRs and geopolitics. They intersect, but I think also you can also usefully distinguish between the two. I'll stop there,
No.
because those are lots of big questions. I can't do justice to all of them, so I'm sure.
That's absolutely fine. Many thanks. It was really revealing, but also about the your point on labor power was very interesting. And also, I would like to re-emphasize before taking Emre İşer's question. You said self-declared governance and self-declared, you know, Arctic countries, Arctic powers. So, and also, they are also now named as global commons. So,
oh yeah, sorry, I should have said something about that. I mean, I think by the way, there's a huge tension there between what is inevitably what is a global commons, and what kind of rights and responsibilities follow from that. But also, I think it's worth saying that I think one of the things that often becomes very contentious is when the Arctic is conflated with the Antarctic and vice versa. Mm-hmm. And I think for many, for all Arctic states and indigenous peoples, nothing causes more upset than the Arctic being compared to the Antarctic. And one of the things I learned quite early on, actually, when I was doing my research, was in the UK, it is quite common to compare the Arctic with the Antarctic. And so there's quite a tradition of thinking about these places comparatively. Whereas if you go to someone like Canada and say, oh yeah, by the way, I'm interested in the Arctic and the Antarctic, you know, often actually there's quite considerable pushback that you're even thinking of these two spaces comparatively. So I think that's quite interesting for those of us who, for example, don't come from Arctic states. And if we think of, you talk about, say, Turkey as polar power, you know, one of the things you might want to do is distinguish quite carefully between where something might be polar and something might be Arctic and Antarctic. And that might be something, for example, the Turkish government or, you know, obvious agencies, I'm sure would be keen to distinguish.
Thank you, Klaus. Emre Hocam?
Thank you,
Sorry
Professor.
for making you wait.
Yeah, no problem at all. You know, I was quite interested in the answer that you've been receiving, because it's partly answering the question in my mind. Actually, most recently, I read from Simon Dalby, Anthropocene Geopolitics. When I was listening to your presentation, I was looking forward to hear some discourses that is similar to what he's been proposing as the solution to this climate change and solution to this Anthropocene, and then we will live happy ever after. But I was quite surprised to hear that you say that there's continuity of this colonialism still in our age, even though, you know, when we read headlines about discussions about climate change, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, they are all been talking about how to address the climate change. But when it comes to Arctic, it seems to me that, again, this classical geopolitics is with us. So my question is, how can it could be possible to, rather than having those discourses about climate change, and really make that shift to that Anthropocene geopolitics and move away from this classical geopolitics? Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that's a really, I think, important question. And I think I should say I've been a sort of admirer and long-standing friend of Simon for 25 years, and I really appreciate his work on Anthropocene geopolitics. He's not the only one to be working on this important area, but he's certainly one that I'm very familiar with. So I think one of the things I always think we have to be slightly careful about is how the Anthropocene gets put to work. And as you know, there's been a huge amount of debate about how the Anthropocene should be framed. There's still a lot of debate, has been a lot of debate about whether it starts with the colonial Colombian encounter, 1492 onwards, or whether actually it has a more recent provenance, at least in human history terms, from the 1940s and 50s onwards, as part of the kind of the nuclear turn and the so-called Great Acceleration. So I think that's one element. It is a very contested concept. The second thing which I'm most uncomfortable with, and this really is why the decolonizing element is so crucial to think about, is there's a tendency, if we're not careful, to think about humanity as a singular. And I think one of the things that we should be very attentive to and careful about is that when we talk about climate change and we recognize the importance of human forcing, particularly forcing generated by industrial capitalism and resource extraction, it's quite clear where the burden of responsibility lies. It's not with indigenous communities in the Arctic. So I think one of the things I'm very cautious about is the way in which the Anthropocene gets bandied about as if somehow, you know, a whole group of nations and rather overprivileged communities have suddenly woken up to the fact that climate change is important. My observation would be is that actually much of the colonial imperial encounter was about creating and transforming environments, and in some cases absolutely interfering with local environmental conditions. And you can think about that either through resource extraction or, for example, through deforestation or dam building, you name it. Terraforming was absolutely part and parcel of the Arctic, and just as much as it was anywhere else in the world when third parties came and made their presence felt. So there are multiple humanities, and the lines of responsibility for climate change are complicated. And one of the things that's interesting about the Arctic is there's been this fundamental shift, I think, in how we might think about the Arctic. In the past, we might have thought about the Arctic as a sink. In other words, where bad things happened and they ended up in the Arctic. And the obvious thing might be, for example, long-range pollutants, might be microplastics, things ending up in the Arctic because they came from somewhere else. What's been transformed, I think, and turned around is the Arctic is now actually having an impact in the other way. So as the Arctic melts, thaws, retreats, it is increasingly making its presence felt in that direction. In other words, from the Arctic outwards. And so that relationality, that, if you like, the position of the Arctic has become increasingly complex. Finally, if we're to talk about Anthracene geopolitics, I think part of where we get away from classical geopolitics is embracing not only the decolonizing element, so thinking carefully, about whose viewpoints, whose knowledges, whose conceptions are being prioritized. But I also think we think explicitly about social justice in ways that aren't just located or locked into particular nation states. So, you know, if, for example, a lot of the European classical geopolitics, was desperately interested in the well-being of particular communities, well, much of that well-being was associated with dominant communities in dominant nation states. I think anthropogenic geopolitics, if to be taken seriously, I think you have to engage with climate justice, social justice, gender justice, indigenous justice, the list goes on. But I think that is absolutely integral to anthropogenic geopolitics. And that is clearly a matter of some urgency, I think, in the Arctic. I don't have to over-rehearse all the impacts of climate change in many parts of the Arctic. You know, this really is ground zero for kind of that disruptiveness, if you will.
Thank you, Professor.
Everett, I just noticed, sorry, it just caught my eye. There's a question in the chat from Sonna. I don't know if he's here and would like to ask it himself, or just I'm very happy to pick up that question.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, I didn't know that we should ask the questions in this way. That's why I wrote it down. So I want to thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting to hear from you. And I would like to ask the questions as I wrote. There is a overlapping maps, as you know, as you pointed out. And my question is about the militarization of Arctic connected with this issue. Because as you know, Iceland and Russia also has some overlapping claims on the Arctic. And Iceland is right now on its path to the independence. So my worry is that, you know, as an independent state, Iceland cannot defend itself against the, you know, threats from Russia, not threats militarily, but Russia is a great power and Iceland alone cannot defend its rights without having some kind of an ally. And what is your foresight about this? Do you think that Iceland could invite somehow NATO to defend its rights as an ally? Or what is the United States position is going to be about this problem?
Okay, so one of the reasons I wanted to get you to tell me about your question is, just to be really clear, I think you mean Greenland, not Iceland.
Oh, I'm sorry, Iceland, no, Greenland, right?
Yeah, okay, because in the chat, you see, you wrote Greenland and Iceland. That's why I wanted just to check with you. We were talking about the same thing. So yeah, so it's a great question. And I didn't talk a huge amount about militarization, again, just because I wanted to be short with my comments. So I think what we can say is this. Number one, there's no question that the Arctic as a sort of theatre, as a military theatre, which is an interesting actually term in its own right, has unquestionably become a great deal more captured by militarization and securitization. And much of that has come about, I think, in the last, again, 10 to 15 years. I think we can partially locate that with the emergence of President Putin and his determination that the Russian Arctic is absolutely integral to the future of the Russian Federation. And there have been a whole series of strategies and public pronouncements that have made it abundantly clear that resource development is absolutely essential. And that, of course, sits rather uneasily, you might say, with the Paris Accord, with climate change, and trying to wean ourselves to take away our dependency on oil and gas. There's absolutely no interest in doing any of that in the Russian Federation. Now, Russia, by the way, has substantial problems in the enormous northern territories, some of which involves permafrost thawing, and some of which involves depopulation. Russia is losing people in the Russian north. So Russia has invested considerably in upgrading its military forces. It's also invested considerably in infrastructure, much of it which is dual use. And the reason, I think, is partly related to the fact that Russia wants the so-called Northern Sea Route, the shipping route above the north of the Federation, to become ever more important. And that brings with it, of course, a whole series of security challenges in terms of how you patrol and survey and achieve domain awareness. Now, on the other side, Russia also works with an Arctic Council of 7 other Arctic states, most of which are NATO members, and 2 of them are closely allied with NATO, namely Sweden and Finland. Greenland is a really interesting and emerging international actor. And really since 2008 onwards, the government of Greenland has become increasingly autonomous. So it's able to carry out a set of activities and interests that in the past would not have been possible within the Kingdom of Denmark. And that has inevitably led to speculation about what is the future of Greenland, whether, for example, an independent Greenland might emerge in due course. And if there was an independent Greenland, it almost certainly would have to involve more resource extraction, not less. And would an independent Greenland, for example, if it developed an even closer relationship with other countries, some of which might include China, some of it which might include Turkey, it could be a whole bunch of countries, would they, for example, begin to think of themselves in a different kind of geopolitical orbit, one in which was not dominated by NATO powers, such as the United States, US, Norway, and so on. So I think at the moment, what we can say is a couple of things. Number one, Greenland is not close to independence, and much of that is simply down to money. But some of it is also down to the fact that the Greenlandic public is divided about independence in terms of the speed of. And this would be, by the way, exactly the same if we were talking about Scotland. You know, there'd be a lot of Scottish voters who would be quite sympathetic to independence, but might be hesitant because things like money matters. I think the second thing is the United States, and Donald Trump started this in 2019. Now, you might have heard his comments about, oh, can we buy Greenland? And you might have thought that's a typically clumsy comment by the former president. But it's not the first time the United States has thought about purchasing Greenland. There have been several offers in the past. And under President Biden, it is highly likely that the United States will continue to develop closer relationships with the government of Greenland, and there will be more aid and assistance. And part of that is driven by a concern that China has developed a stronger relationship with Greenland and has been interested in investing in infrastructure. And another way of thinking about geopolitics, of course, is through infrastructure, and that takes on enormous importance in the Arctic, not least because infrastructure is so expensive in the Arctic. But with infrastructure, as we all know, comes that capacity to extend mobility and potentially influence. So I don't think Greenland, through Denmark, will be leaving NATO anytime soon. And I think the United States, I think interestingly, is potentially putting Denmark in an awkward position as it seeks to improve and strengthen its relationship with the government of Greenland directly. And so one of the things we're seeing in the Arctic, which is quite intriguing, is indigenous peoples are now in many cases substantial land and resource rights holders. So if you go to Alaska, there are lots of native corporations, and those native corporations are perfectly capable of negotiating relationships with companies, organizations, states all over the world. And non-Arctic states, if you will, like Singapore, are perfectly capable of developing direct relationships with indigenous groups and indigenous communities all over the Arctic. So as geographers, we're often quite interested in scale jumping, but also these kind of relationalities in the Arctic, where, you know, a country like Turkey, for example, could become ever more entangled in the Arctic, not only through the movement of labor, Turkish labor going into the Arctic, but also, for example, the government of Turkey potentially creating direct relationships with indigenous communities, whether it's the government of Greenland, native corporations in Alaska, or anywhere else for that matter. So I think I think when we use the term, for example, global Arctic, it can be a slightly sort of messy term, but I think what it's trying to do, at least, is to show that these relationships are cutting across, the global, the circumpolar, the national state, and the local, even community level. So I think it's a brilliant question, but it's really difficult to answer succinctly because there's so many things to think about. And your second point, I will pick that up for you through the chat, is you said the Arctic is becoming less exceptional. In your opinion, Arctic is going to be a region of cooperation between coastal states or competitors will be huge enough to actually bring in non-Arctic states in Arctic geopolitics. That's already happening. So one of the interesting things I think is happening in the Arctic is in 2018-19, there was an agreement to deal with commercial fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean, and 10 signatories were party to that agreement. The details don't really matter at this point, But what does matter, and this might have implications for Turkey, by the way, is 5 Arctic coastal states were involved in the agreement: Norway, Russia, Canada, Denmark, Greenland, and the United States, and 5 non-Arctic players were involved. So that was China, Korea, Japan, the European Union, interestingly, and Iceland. So one of the consequences of Brexit for us here in the UK was we're no longer party to that agreement. So here's an open question for you. Would the government of Turkey, alongside the United Kingdom and others, seek in due course to become a signatory to that agreement? Would they be accepted or welcomed? Or would they be treated with intense suspicion that they might want to become party to such an agreement? So I think what I'm trying to say is there are lots of things going on where I think who or what belongs in the Arctic or doesn't belong is under scrutiny. I think that's probably one way of putting it.
Wow, fantastic question and fantastic answer, really. Lots of food for thought lies in it. Any other questions?
Maybe I can join in.
Should I feel something? Oh, okay. Go ahead, Serdar.
Professor, thank you very much. That's a great pleasure to have you here this evening and great presentation. What I would like to maybe comment and ask is about Turkey's role not in Arctic region, but in Antarctic region. There is a recent article by Lerna Yanık and Emrah Karaoz on Turkey's role in Antarctic region, scientific expedition, Turkey's recent scientific mission in Antarctic, and how it turned out to be a manifestation of power for Turkey. So do you think Arctic or Antarctic, the polar regions, are they spaces for a middle power to claim itself as a great power somehow? So these scientific missions are used particularly in practical or popular geopolitics as manifestations of power. What do you think about that? And could Turkey be perceived as some kind of a great power in this respect because it has a scientific mission now in the Antarctic region? Thank you very much.
No, I think that's a really important question. So the way I read Turkey, contemporary Turkey, is I think this is a republic that sees itself as a regional superpower, and one that I think has a portfolio actually of global interests that I think goes in hand with the ambition that the country has to be more than just simply a regional player. One of the ways, by the way, I think you can always track that I'm sure there must be a project in this, but I always thought it'd be fascinating to do a project involving Turkish Airlines. And I always thought what would be brilliant is to look at the places Turkish Airlines flies to now, and then go backwards and compare and contrast it every 5 or 10 years, because that probably tells you something interesting about where some of Turkey's interests, some of which might be labor, some of which might be capital, some of it might be strategic military alliances, as well as good old-fashioned tourism and business, of course. The polar regions have always been a place where middle powers, as you say, and I agree with you, have sought to have, if you like, extraordinary influence. So the best example would be, I think, Australia. In the Antarctic, that because it's a huge claimant state, has sought to be a great power in the Antarctic, and often found that difficult to do so because, unfortunately for Australia, the 2 biggest players that have scientific stations in Australian Antarctic territory historically and contemporary sense, have been the Soviet Union, Russia, and China. So that makes it quite difficult to sort of, if you like, juxtapose the limits of being a middle power. And of course, Canada and Australia and countries like these were often thought about and written about under that banner of sort of middle power diplomacy, middle power geopolitics. I think Turkey has recognized that the Antarctic Treaty System, established really from 1959-61 onwards, was framed very deliberately to favor the interests of the 12 parties who created the Antarctic Treaty. And so you'll notice, of course, the membership criteria in terms of if you want to become a consultative party makes great emphasis on substantial scientific research. The word substantial was never defined anywhere. And really what we've discovered is over the years is the parties who are already the consultative powers get to decide when and where something is substantial. So I think what Turkey, along with other states such as China, has quite rightly discovered and worked out for itself is, and this is something Homi Bhabha talked about many years ago, is the importance of mimicry. So actually understanding the rules of the game and actually using the very same techniques and strategies that others have used, both great powers and smaller powers like the United Kingdom. And then over time, as I think China is doing, is you then begin to shape those norms, those values, and potentially also introduce new rules that actually shift, if you will, the nature of the governance or the nature of the particular international regime. So the way I read Turkey's scientific endeavors, I think is very much, I mean, from my point of view, this seems to me the kind of the steps you would take to become a polar power. And you'd probably also tell me, and I'd really genuinely be interested in this, is whether in popular culture as well, have you noticed over the last 5 or 10 years, whatever the time frame, more and more, for example, documentaries about the Antarctic, more and more TV coverage? Has there been postage stamps issued celebrating the achievements of Turkish scientists? You know, those kind of things. And I think that's where I think I would love to know more about the Turkish context, is are you seeing a kind of polar culture starting to take hold? Because usually what happens in the start is, you know, you get a certain pushback from others. Say, why is Turkey interested in the Arctic? Why is Turkey interested in the Antarctic? You know, it's a country in the Middle East. And so there's this kind of weird geographical determinism that suggests that, you know, you're and this is where the classical geopolitics comes in. You know, you're this sort of Middle Eastern country. Why on earth would you be interested in ice and cold places? And Singapore faced that. You know, you're a tropical country. Why on earth? Well, the whole point about climate change is these elemental distinctions get scrambled. Yeah. So those kind of fixed geographies don't make sense anymore. I mean, for example, if the Antarctic continues to melt and sea level rise continues to perpetuate itself, ditto in the Arctic, then we're all entangled with the Arctic and Antarctic in some kind of sense. So I think I'm kind of interested in the kind of, if you like, the cultural conversation as much as anything Turkey's having with itself, and whether it's being read as it was, for example, the 1980s with India and Pakistan, you know, as this is what emerging, powerful countries do. You know, they show that there are no limits, no geographical limits to where they wished their presence to be felt.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
May I ask a question? Hello, Professor Dodds. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. First of all, I will apologize for my English because I'm a French-speaking scholar and I give all of my lectures in French. Sometimes I'm translating from French to English, so my apologies. It was a very interesting presentation. It was very exciting for me because I'm a political sociologist, and unfortunately I will change a little bit the direction of the discussion because they are all IAR scholars here, although their discussions are very, very interesting. My questions are different because when you were talking about the representations of Arctic or Arctic representations, I was shocked. I got the impression that it's regularly a male-dominated area, in my opinion. Am I right? What are the representations of women in this area? Do we use female figures, metaphors, symbols, and when and where? For what aspect? Because as Mustafa Hocam cited it, the article in questions by Lena, Professor Lena, there were lots of women representation of Turkish nationality, especially among scholars. So I think it's a very important point. And secondly, when you were talking about Arctic, you were underlining continuously the place. And of course, when you talk about place, I thought about time and the formation of memory. What about the formation, the role of the Arctic in the formation of memory, especially in formation of nationalism in this area? They are very vast questions. I know that they are very large questions, but I think your insights are very, very important, very precious in this subject. And thank you very much once again for joining us.
Thank you very much. And thank you for these excellent questions. And again, I'm so sorry, actually, when all these great questions come, you realize actually how little you've really said in the short period of time. So, but it gives me a great opportunity to talk about these things now. So that I welcome that, thank you. So your point about gender and the Arctic is well taken. So two things really. Number one, in terms of a great deal of colonial imperial discourse about both the Arctic and the Antarctic, it has been remarkably common to do two things. One is to feminize the Arctic and the Antarctic. So for example, Richard Byrd, the great American explorer, talked about the Antarctic as the sleeping princess. And luckily, the sleeping princess was going to be disturbed by all these American men working their way all over the Antarctic. So one. Number two, and my colleague Veronica Deladora has written brilliantly about this. There's been also this very interesting metaphor, which is about lifting the veil. So the idea that we were sort of peeling something away, exposing something to the male gaze has been remarkably enduring and alluring. So again, this idea that the Arctic, Antarctic, highly feminized spaces, and a lot of excellent feminist scholarship. Lisa Bloom, for example, wrote a wonderful book in 1993, Gender on the Ice, that kind of explored some of this really very, very important topic. Now, what I think is interesting is really about where we are with the kind of gendering of the Arctic and gender and Arctic geopolitics in general. So I think there's a couple of things I would say. Number one, I think is just a kind of, I think, important observation about many, many northern indigenous communities across the Arctic in particular, which is that often women are really, really important spokespersons for those communities. And for example, the new Governor General of Canada is Mary Simon, an extraordinary woman who very interestingly actually made the point that when she spoke about her appointment, that she was a bilingual Canadian. And she apologized for not knowing French, but her first language was Inuktitut, and then second language English. So she was very clear that there were at least 3 languages, even if Canada only recognizes 2 officially. So that was I think really important and interesting. The second thing to say is there's a really very vibrant strand of intersectional, feminist scholarship again, which has been looking at gender in ways that goes way beyond just simply gender in isolation, as you would expect, but also taking in the sort of racialized, ethnic, classified politics as well, that is absolutely integral to making sense of the Arctic as a sort of very complex space with lots of different actors' interests, but also divisions, injustices, schisms, that kind of thing. So I could not agree more. I think what's really interesting, by the way, is also the ways in which, even in some contemporary discourse, climate change gets spoken about with regards to the Arctic in quite gendered terms. So the idea that these kind of spaces are becoming uncontrollable, they're overflowing, I think is often shot through with highly gendered vocabularies and framings that then seem to, yet again, prioritize and privilege certain often highly masculinized displays of power and intervention. So I think that's, for me, quite troubling, actually. And then the second thing on the role of memory, I think that's incredibly interesting because one of the things that interests me is not only what we remember, but also, I'm sure, what we don't remember, what we think is not worthy of citation, or what we think is not worthy of being in a national archive, for example. And one of the great tensions I think exists in the Arctic is that many indigenous cultures, of course, have often been oral cultures. And so there has been this sort of tremendous, at times, struggle, I think, to ensure that oral histories, oral memories of indigenous communities aren't trampled over, dominated, eviscerated even by the sort of the textual records, the archives, or, for example, the statues. And you've probably seen in Canada, again, we've also had, as in the United Kingdom, statues being torn down as part of a sort of broader, I think, resistance or pushback to dominant stories, dominant memories and framings, not only of the Arctic, but also the kind of the history and the geography of the nation state. And I think that's where settler colonialism is so hugely important in so many parts of the Arctic, because of its connections to official memorializing, to legal systems, to the production of national histories and geographies. And for example, I mean, I'll end on this note, which you're just really excellent question, is I would have a suspicion that there would still be an awful lot of people in Arctic states who would not be aware of the history of residential schools, for example. And that you would, so these were indigenous folks were taken to residential schools somewhere else and told to stop speaking their native language and effectively become model Danish or Canadian citizens or whatever it might be. And maybe wouldn't even realize that you could still meet people in their 30s or 40s who had had the experience of these so-called residential schools. So I think it's just incredibly important. I couldn't agree more with you. These memory regimes are just so fundamental. And my worry is when we have all this anthropogenic turning, everything now is anthropogenic, this and that, it becomes almost too easy to simply think that that's in the past. We don't have to do the important work of remembering the past, or past plural, sorry, I should say.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Many thanks, Eylem, and many thanks again, Klaus. I think we have another question from Professor İşeri, but also can I just point out one thing and continue the conversation before it diminishes. Eylem pointed out the gender aspect, also citing the Lerna Yanık's recent article in Third World Quarterly. Yes, it's a really, really important and interesting dimension, but I just want to underline the interesting Oriental aspect and anti-Oriental aspect as a grand strategy which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work, of Ottoman Empire, or a kind of grand strategy through gender images to counter the Orientalist regimes of the West towards the Ottoman Empire. Because very interestingly, actually, I wrote this in a Turkish chapter. The name was Visual Diplomacy and the Images of Women. In that chapter, I was trying to give some examples from the 19th century French Orientalists, how they paint, how they encode the Ottoman women, because the empire was sick. The Ottoman Empire was sick. The emperor, the Padishah, was old and lonesome, and his harem was being visualized as a geopolitical resource up for grabs. And the harem, the women of the harem were either being veiled or either being stripped naked, just as the landscape, because the territorial intervention was at play to rape, if you like, the harem, the landscape of the sick emperor. So at this very particular moment, very interestingly, especially Serdar Hocam is mostly interested in the late Ottoman history. Some very prominent Turkish intellectuals, and especially military chiefs, were painters. And even some of them were educated in France, in Paris, by Monet and Gérôme and others. And very interestingly, by using the same standards, they were trying to counter that female image of the empire. They were trying to showcase how the Ottoman women, unlike the French Orientalist gaze, was well versed in German. For example, in one Osman Hamdi Bey's pictures, paintings, was one harem woman was reading Goethe in German. She was holding Faust in her hands. And in another painting, they were playing Beethoven via the notes on there, via piano, and in the same similar environment with male. So they were trying to push back that popular geopolitics. Yes, geopolitics was not a name at that moment, but they were conscious of how they're being played out, how they're being gazed, how they're being captured by the male gaze, Orientalist gaze. So very interestingly, when today in the Antarctic and also in the Arctic, we see Turkish women scientists. And this is not just contemporary politics. It has a wider, a century, at least 2 centuries of politics inside of it. That's very interesting. So thanks, Eylem, actually, for pointing this out. Maybe another, article might come out from us at that intersection. And lastly, sorry, Emre, I'm just coming. Maybe my last question. As a professor of geopolitics, maybe one thing we should note again, the retreating and thawing ice. You also mentioned the emergence of the Northern Passage, but maybe we should emphasize it a bit more. Through the retreating, thawing ice, the geopolitics, the whole world trade system, the physical background of it, weaved by the Western interests in the last 500 years, the physical dimension of the geopolitics, of the last 500 years is changing. This is an extremely important case because not only geopolitics is being rewritten there, reverse engineered by Russia and China. They're learning the rules by reverse engineering, but also the whole physical structure viewed by the Western interests and Western trade routes is changing. So what do you think about the future of the geopolitics in this case? I'm sorry, Emre, next is yours. I just wanted to use my privilege here.
No, it's just a quick question. I was just wondering about Professor's opinion. You know, when you've been commenting on Turkey, and you also gave the example of Singapore, I guess. Yeah. Small power, so over there, but interested in other places. So nowadays I've been working on an article on public diplomacy as well. So it resonates to me a lot about, you know, maybe public diplomacy and critical geopolitics could be combined. And maybe, so what could be your opinion in that regard? So do you see a kind of a, in the literature, there's a space to be filled from your perspective? Thank you very much.
Sorry, I forgot I was on mute. Yes, I mean, I think, for example, if you look at some of the work that's coming out in journals like the Hague Journal of Diplomacy or Public Diplomacy, sorry, I can't quite remember the title. I mean, my sense is public diplomacy is a really sort of pretty actually interdisciplinary field. And I think one of the areas in which you could imagine, to take this question first, sort of popular critical geopolitics and public diplomacy, I think working with one another in probably quite interesting ways is actually to think about how both the public and the diplomatic are made and remade through and by places. So public diplomacy, in essence, is never spaceless or placeless. It is usually directed in some kind of ways. And also it has, and this really goes to Evren's point as well, actually. I mean, part of what you're all talking about, Evren, as well, is the kind of pushback, I think, that came in the aftermath of Said's work, which seemed to suggest that, you know, the Middle East, the Orient, was simply a space where there was no agency, there was no pushback, there was no kind of countervailing narratives, images, and texts. And I think for me, what makes science diplomacy or public diplomacy really interesting is also precisely when things break down, or when they don't, for example, have the, if you will, intended consequences, or when, for example, public and science diplomacy are put to work and perhaps overly depended upon in places like the Arctic to try and hold on to more collaborative or cooperative visions of and for the Arctic. And so, for example, it's been quite interesting to see how Britain and Russia have used scientific cooperation, particularly amongst early career researchers, as a way of trying to hold on to some kind of relationship with one another, when arguably the relationship between the United Kingdom and Russia is very poor and is likely to remain very poor for some time. I mean, Evren, your point about, I think, emergence and disappearance, I think is really interesting in terms of a kind of earthly geopolitics. So one of the things that's, I think, provoking a lot of discussion in countries like China and Singapore and Korea is the prospect of a shipping route opening up across the Central Arctic Ocean, the so-called Transpolar Route. And there's been a lot of discussion about how, in due course, maritime trade might be reorientated fundamentally away from the Straits of Malacca through the Suez Canal. And this is a new opportunity to create a shipping route, a line of mobility in international waters that didn't depend upon certain geographically proximate states. And maybe that explains why Russia is so eager to extend its influence over ever more parts of the Arctic Ocean, both water and seabed. And so this idea of the Arctic melting and retreating, I think, is not just, I think, a reference to physical state change, but I think also can be thought of quite productively as a set of powerful metaphors, actually, to think about not only the Arctic, but also the likely shape of global geopolitics in the future, where certain things just either melt or disappear, or perhaps thaw, become mushy, become a little bit more indistinct, where rules, norms, values are not quite as solid as they might once have seemed. And I think part of that is simply also reflecting something the UK government is very mindful of when it talks in its latest integrated review, which was published earlier this year, was that the UK needs to tilt ever more towards the Indo-Pacific region and recognize that it's in a far more competitive strategic environment than ever before. So I think there are lots of interesting things that go on the Arctic, which I think do speak to broader, if you like, conceptual as well as policy relevant concerns.
Okay, so any other questions? Thoughts we have? Also, we can tease out Klaus thoughts about popular geopolitics as well. If not, let me ask my last question. When is your newest book on James Bond is coming out? Hopefully. So
I don't have any more books in me on James Bond, but I probably will almost certainly continue to collaborate with my Bond co-author, Lisa Fennell, who's a sort of gender popular culture scholar, and that's been enormous fun to write with her. But I think the book I haven't yet penned, but I probably should do, is one on popular geopolitics more generally. And so James Bond's been obviously a sort of really interesting way to think about popular geopolitics, but that's probably the book I ought to write at some point. I think one of the things, everyone, I will say, and this is probably true of everybody here as well, is that, if you have multiple interests, inevitably some things dominate more than others. And as you've probably sensed, the Arctic has just become enormously important and significant to so many countries, including the United Kingdom and Turkey, that actually it's provided huge amount of opportunity to work in that space. And I think part of the challenges is, as academics, is I think in general we tend to be interested in so many things, and I think curious, intelligent people often find it very difficult to focus on one thing alone because we're interested in so many things. And I think it's I think that's one of the joys of what we do. But the final thing about, actually, I will say about James Bond, one of the things I will be doing with Lisa is an edited collection on global James Bond. So one of the things that we're really interested in, and we have actually, I think, 2 Turkish-based scholars in the collection, is writing about not only about how James Bond was received in certain countries, as and when the films appeared, but far more interestingly, and this is something I didn't really appreciate until talking to this group of scholars from around the world, the ways in which those particular popular cultures not only had their own spies, fictional spies, as you'd expect, but even more interestingly, staged all kinds of cultural encounters between James Bond and their national spy heroes, and produced a kind of set of literatures and films that actually either, for example, made fun of James Bond, so mocked James Bond, or took James Bond very seriously and saw him as a worthy adversary, or produced this kind of wonderful hybrid culture of spies intermingling with one another. So I think what it does is it just reminds us, if we needed reminding, and it comes back to your point about Orientalism, is that these kind of broad brush treatments of culture, popular or otherwise, are always likely to be not only crude, but also fail, I think, to distinguish the incredible nuances that exist within these sort of cultural imaginaries and encounters. So I think, again, whether it's, you know, Turkish women reading Goethe or whether it's contemporary James Bond, there's always more to be said about these kind of cultural exchanges that just make it abundantly clear that this kind of top-down, one-way, colonized model, or whatever you want to think of it, just won't do.
Many thanks, Klaus. By the way, apologies if I misunderstood our earlier conversation. I maybe mistook the point that a new book coming out about James Bond, or you're on such a project as well. But yeah, hopefully, and any book written by you will be welcomed by all of us. I think Soner just raised his hand again. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to say one thing more. So Mr. Dodd asked about the popular culture, you know, in the Turkey about the Arctic. I can say one thing, that in Turkish, you know, popular culture, it is a common belief that, or there are some works about that Inuit community is a part of the Turkic family. And yeah, it is, there are some articles even written about that. And in the you know, within the popular culture, it is getting, as I saw, it is getting more and more attraction. So it is one thing that you can say about the Turkish nation, so that the Turkish nation will attract itself into the area. So it is happening in Turkey, and I actually hope that, you know, it is going to create some connections between the indigenous people in the region and Turkey.
Thank you. I really appreciate that comment, because one thing I think that's been enormously interesting about representations of the Arctic and the North is the ways in which these connections constantly get made, whether it's through, for example, population movement, whether it's through historic exchanges of goods, trades, peoples, whether it's through mythologies, where, for example, you know, you'll find some people in India say, well, look, there is a rich tradition, for example, of Hindu mythology that thinks of the frozen north, the far north, as hugely significant. And I think one of the things we're seeing as well, which, and I completely understand that point. This is a point also that's sometimes been made to me in China as well, is that actually, if you think about the ways in which peoples moved to populate the Arctic, the North, over the millennia, they came from somewhere and went somewhere else. And so actually tracing those movements, those arcs, has been terrifically important for many countries in trying to kind of show that this sharp distinction between Arctic and non-Arctic is one that they're not necessarily going to accept. And I think that's partly the pushback from the sort of presumption that there are 8 Arctic states, everybody else is non-Arctic. And I think it's again, it comes to the point actually made earlier about the importance of time and memory. So it's not just about spatial flows and those relationalities, it's also about how time and memory get put to work to create, if you will, sort of futures as much as past.
So we are trying to rewrite the memory regimes, the narratives about the Arctic countries and non-Arctic countries to find solutions, or to find geopolitical solutions to the regions again. And part of the issue is also about the stories, huh?
And it's also about thinking about entanglements. And so one of the interesting things about that entanglement between, say, for example, Turkic peoples and Arctic peoples, let me put it in those terms, is also it's very interesting because actually, if you think about the stories that, for example, the United Kingdom would tell about its entanglements in the North American Arctic, it's a very different story. It's a very different story. It's one that's punctuated by colonialism and imperialism. Whereas here you've got a different kind of story. And that's also something that China, of course, has been quite keen to mobilize, is to say, look, here's a counter narrative. Here's a narrative that isn't characterized by the formal structures of empire that Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, they're the ones who must carry the weight of a certain kind of history.
Also, when you mentioned about the mythologies and the narratives about the North, especially about the Russian Arctic and the flow of people there, do you know that in the Siberian region, there are Sakas? The native population is called Sakas, and in many Turkish understanding, they're Saka Turks. They're called Saka Turks. And interestingly, yes, Russia is the biggest, is the widest country on earth. However, it has interestingly diminishing population. Its population is, I guess it was around 180 million right now, I guess, right? Something like that.
Yeah, so I think that's a key fact of life for the Russian Arctic. Has been, it is depopulating.
That's why they actually sold Alaska to the United States, right?
Well, I think it was, I mean, it was partly also a revenue raising exercise. But yes, I mean, fundamentally, one of the great challenges for Russia has been to manage this enormous territory that is not only depopulating, but also, as said before, is being increasingly affected by intensifying climate change. And the two obvious areas are wildfires that are likely to get worse every year. And the second is permafrost thawing that carries with it really, really expensive, disruptive costs. But again, I think that coming back to Sonna's point about Turkic peoples, I mean, I think what's really interesting is I think there's been quite an emphasis, it seems to me, in Turkish political discourse about this kind of arc, arc of Turkic peoples. And what's interesting, and I don't know enough about the Turkish context, but what I'd be intrigued by is whether the arc gets ever longer or whether it extends ever further northwards. As, for example, geopolitical ambition changes or foreign policy priorities alter. And simply to say, I think this has been incredibly important because it's enabled countries that, you know, on the face of it, and this is the whole point, it's partly the pushback against thinking that why should a country X be interested in the Arctic? And one way to counter that is to say, look, there are these different histories, geographies, mythologies, whatever it might be, that we can assemble for, you know, various reasons. And in the European case, like the United Kingdom, it's often one grounded in geographical proximity or various kinds of historical, economic, cultural connections. And so I think what you're seeing is there's a whole group of countries, including the European Union as an organization, making these sorts of connections and interrelationships ever more explicit. I think that's the key thing.
Very interestingly, that Turkish geopolitics or Turkic geopolitics, the region we are talking about, the base region, is the very region Mackinder talked about, the heartland. Because those heartlandic area is mostly populated by either sovereign Turkic states or populated by mostly under the Russian sovereignty, of course, Turkic nations. So one way to Turkey to merge, to assemble, to entangle all those regions is part of the one to push back the previous geopolitical containment by the West and Russia. It's a pushback opportunity through population, through culture as well, and also a kind of soft power, if you like, to say that, yes, we are able to display some power in these regions. We are able to, actually, we have a say because we have a population. We have a native population since thousands of years. So we can extend the dimensions, the historical dimensions of current Turkic geopolitics to those understandings as well. This is very interesting. That's why I actually, I wanted to push you further about your last comment on that TRT interview, because you underlined the importance of Turkey's operability of labor power in the region. That's really interesting. And lastly, yes, even the Siberian region is populated by Saka Turks. So imagine Turkey's ability to push back there, if it can, or we don't know how it will use.
No, but I think again, I think what we're kind of talking about is really partly these kind of, you know, they are partly relationships, but it is also about generating relational geographies and histories.
Yeah.
And I think so much of this is about really coming to terms with a sort of whole series of competing spatial imaginaries in terms of what the Arctic is. And really what I've been trying to emphasize, I think in part, is, you know, there is this kind of very, very powerful indigenous Arctic as homeland, which is, I think, incredibly important. And that sits awkwardly, I think, with the sort of the nation, the 8 Arctic states, the set of colonial logics of the Arctic being sort of portioned up into these 8 national territories, plus, you know, ocean bits left over. But then with this other one, which is this kind of one which at one stage the United States was cultivating, the idea of a global Arctic, where the Arctic becomes this kind of meeting place, or perhaps this bridge where the global and the Arctic interconnect with one another. And, you know, if you have a sort of regime, or in this case, to be honest, an intergovernmental organization like the Arctic Council that puts so much emphasis on Arctic states and indigenous peoples, and everybody else is simply observers or non-states, I think it also encourages, I suspect, that kind of, as I say, relational work, where actually, you know, you're in part, you are pushing back and you're saying, actually, I'm not prepared to simply be an observer. I'm not prepared to be simply framed as a non-Arctic state. And really what that comes back to again is how does one conceptualize the Arctic? You know, is it this place where you can draw a line around and say, that's the Arctic, that's non-Arctic? Is it this, in essence, leaking volume that things are constantly, energy, matter is constantly going in and out and being exchanged and converted into something else? Or is it, as is any other region, a place where national, regional and international legal regimes and governance arrangements actually have to, you know, intersect and do intersect with one another? And that creates its own set of, I think, both tensions as well as opportunities.
By the way, Didem just joined us. Thanks, Didem. As you might remember, Didem is also one of our fellow Royal Holloway graduates. She was just able to join us as well. Welcome, Didem.
Just to say hi. I'm sorry I missed your speech, but I'm going to listen to it as you agreed to register. Thank you so much. And it's been a great privilege to have you with us today. And Chris has always talked about you. And I'm also very interested in your students' thesis, which are using cartoons. That's how I heard about you for the first time from Chris. He said that I could use some innovative methods, and he gave examples of your students that you suggested. So I'm really sorry. I regret not having met you at Royal Holloway, and I hope everything is great there right now. And thank you so much for being with us today.
No, thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't meet you in person at Royal Holloway. And you know, Chris was a wonderful colleague, and I think also very, very inspiring as well. And we did have many conversations together about the intersection between international relations and geopolitics. And I still retain an interest in cartoons and that kind of visual culture. And again, I think that might be another thing. I'd be quite interested to know whether you know, you're starting to get in Turkey as well cartoons about the Arctic and the Antarctic as yet another indicator of how polar consciousness might be working its way through you know, Turkey's sort of cultural spaces. So yeah, no, that's thank you for that, and yeah, Royal Holloway's doing okay. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful.
Okay, folks, any other questions? Last question. Do we have?
I'm going to wave to that young person I see.
Adriel. Well, actually,
young geographer in the making, I hope.
Truly. Also, my cousin, my little, actually, he's not that little anymore, Tolga Sereze. I think he's still with us as well. He's 17 and he's enormously interested in polar regions and history. So I invited him to join us as well. I think he's still with us right now as well. So right. You have young followers among us. Hopefully we're going to send them in the future to Royal Holloway again.
Well, that would be very exciting. I think all you need to know, my two children are not very interested in geography, so I don't know where I've gone wrong. So I don't know what happened. No interest in geography.
I'm sure that they're following your guidance in much more different ways.
Maybe.
I should point that out that, yeah, again, because I want to point it out to everyone. Klaus is one of the, truly I can say that one of the first, most humble, and secondly, most humane people in academia I've ever seen. Without his support, probably I couldn't cope with my travails at the time. So many thanks, Klaus.
No, my pleasure. No, my pleasure. And it was a real pleasure to join you all as well. And honestly, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak with everybody and also hear your wonderful questions. And I really do appreciate it, because if it's 8:30 here, it must be 10:30 where you are probably. And I'm amazed actually we've kept going and having such a nice conversation. And I'm very impressed. As I say, our youngest participant is still very much alive and awake and very lively. So that's very impressive. So yeah, that's great. No, thank you. I really
cannot sleep without me, so I have to help him for sleeping. So he was with me, yes, every time.
Oh, it's so cute, because I think, you know, particularly as your own children get older and older, you kind of, you forget, you know, all that important work that needs to happen.
You're right. Dis bonjour. Bonjour.
Bonjour. Ça va?
Tu dis ça va?
Ça va.
Ça va.
Ah, very good. Bien. Bon nuit. Lovely. Yes, everyone. Okay. Thank you again for the kind invitation. I really appreciate it, and I hope maybe one day, you know, we will be able to have sort of more, you know, face-to-face conversations and dialogue. I'm sure, like everybody else, I really miss that. I think there's just no substitute.
Exactly. I'm really looking for that, and hopefully one day I'll get back there somehow, you know, because of everything, I couldn't even participate in my own ceremony, my own PhD ceremony and everything else.
I know. I know.
Unfortunately, hopefully one day I fill that gap. I feel that gap.
Yeah, no,
Anyway.
I absolutely, I really do hope so. But thank you again, everybody, and thanks for hosting. And I wish you well with everyone and colleagues with the rest of the seminar series and the conversations you're having. I think they're just, you know, it sounds like a really wonderful opportunity to have that dialogue.
Okay, thank you very much, Klaus, again.
Thank you.
It was such a privilege, and thank you, everyone. I'm closing this session right now. I hope you have a wonderful day, Klaus, and get well soon. Thanks for joining us after that hospital appointment as well. It was very...
Yeah, no problem at all. I'm sorry for my cold. I'm just, that's another thing that's just, I'm always blowing my nose at the moment, but yes, no, thanks. It was great to be here.
Hope you get well soon. Okay, good night, everyone. Bye-bye. Hope to see you again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hope to see you again. Bye-bye.